Warhammer 40k Darktide has some crazy potential, but if we're being honest, it's being seriously held back by some developer decisions that, quite frankly, just don't make a whole lot of sense. Hey there friends, it's Codiak here, welcome to Legacy Gaming. Today, we're going to talk shop and break down 5 changes that could be huge for the game. As always, when putting together a video like this, I like to remind folks that these ideas are based off of my opinions. You can disagree with me, that's okay. In fact, if you have ideas, feel free to put them in the comments section below. I know for a fact that developers frequently check out content from the community, and I've seen a lot of thought put into some of the comments on our previous videos, so let's not look at this as a moment to complain, but an opportunity to address some of the things that Fatshark could change to make the game even better. If I were to prioritize this list, I'd say the number one thing for me would be cross-progression, specifically with a focus on shared resources. Right now, Darktide just feels like a siloed experience, and that just doesn't feel right in the modern era of gaming. As it currently stands, your progression on one character is completely independent from another character, and that really becomes an issue when you look at the gameplay loop. If the idea is to get the best gear possible so that you can push into the harder difficulties, well then, that's going to take some serious material farming. The devs are pretty stingy with the plasteel and diamantine drops during runs, and the fact that those are relegated to the individual character, not the account, is really the root of the problem. What this ultimately does is discourages players from having alts. Now I get that this isn't an MMO, but I'd be much more inclined to work on a new Ogren or Zealot if I knew that the crafting reagents I was collecting would be usable on my main character, my Psyker. And by no means am I suggesting leveling up one levels up all characters. No way. The XP grind should 100% be independent, but that doesn't mean every system needs to be that way. Players are going to feel differently about this issue, but I know it's real and I know it's a pain point because I see people talking about it constantly on the Darktide subreddit and Discord. In fact, amongst our own team, it's an issue. Our buddy Schmoses, who mains a Zealot, really doesn't have the desire to level another character because in his mind, it's kind of pointless when he only plans on pushing progression on his Zealot. The other side of this coin really has to do with the weekly quest system and just how untenable it actually is. For example, in order to complete 25 weekly missions, you have to spend a little over 8 hours grinding out levels. That's assuming each mission takes exactly 20 minutes and there's no downtime in between. Sadly, that progression doesn't cross over onto other characters, so you're looking at 25 missions on a single character, which might prevent you from exploring the other classes in the game. In my mind, this is a simple fix. Rework the weekly missions to carry across all characters, slightly amp up the rewards, and even possibly rework the requirements, which all would incentivize people to really focus on the weeklies. I would even go so far as to throw a skin or two into the mix to really dangle that carrot in front of players. To make the system even better, I would also remove any map-specific weekly quests. I don't know a single player who wants to try and deal with these. You're battling map rotation RNG and trying to complete some secondary challenge on a specific mission that may, but most likely isn't available when you're actively doing these weeklies. It really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If cross-progression did become a thing, you could even replace these with weeklies that are more class-specific to further incentivize players to branch out and play different characters, experiencing the full scope of the game. Something simple like execute 100 bull rushes on an Ogren or brain burst 100 enemies on a Psyker would be much more enjoyable than the current offering of missions and wouldn't feel like a huge burden on the player. When you boil it down, there's a lot that developers could do to make the gameplay more connected and honestly more replayable. Small tweaks to existing systems and some major changes to how character progression works would be a huge step in the right direction. This next idea isn't going to shock anyone. It's a fully realized crafting system. At this point, I think we can all agree that it was a huge mistake to not include crafting as part of the launch. From an optics perspective, it made the game feel incomplete, and as a huge component of the endgame, it really left a lot to be desired. The main issue remains. Darktide is not an early access title. According to Fatshark, it's a complete experience. Sure, it's built on a live service model, but to not have a foundational system ready to go on day one left a lot of folks feeling jaded, gypped, and downright angry. As is clear from the developers' updates, the team is launching each piece of crafting in drips and drabs, and I'll be honest, I don't understand why. If it's a balancing issue, then it goes back to the point I made in a previous video. The game should have been delayed, the beta extended, anything. There's a myriad of things the team could have done. That being said, once crafting is fully released into the game, it's going to be a huge selling point for the replayability and overall endgame loop. Me personally, I'm super excited about the prospect of really fine-tuning my weapons to make them as potent as they can be. Our team has been pushing the harder difficulties, and any moderate improvements to my weapons would most likely net some pretty significant results. Opening up crafting would also just make the endgame grind a bit more palatable. As we just discussed, right now, the only way to gain crafting reagents is by playing the one character you want those materials on. That means endless grinding, run after run, and at the moment, what you can do with your items is really limiting, which doesn't make the grind feel worth it. If you're curious why a game that had a nearly 110,000 player concurrent peak is down more than 50% after just 2 weeks, we'll look no further than an endgame that simply isn't complete. This one is simple. Release the crafting system, even if the balance isn't perfect. If the system isn't complete, that's one thing, and Fatshark should be honest about that, but if the devs are worried about balance or optimization, I'd say that ship has kind of sailed. Of course, players will always come rushing back with the introduction of a new class or map, but again, to not have this foundational system in at launch is a huge oversight. I'm always a fan of giving the players more bang for their buck. Of course, there's a balance to it, but at the end of the day, if you're making a player feel like they're being rewarded for their actions, it's going to go a long way to establishing player loyalty. Darktide misses the mark a few different ways in this department, but I really don't think they're hard things to fix, and with a few tweaks, I think the net positives would be huge for the developers and the community. First is the end of mission rewards. Just like in Vermintide 2, what happened to those guaranteed items at the end of every mission, Fatshark? We miss them, and we want them. No lie, I get so pumped when I see an item pop up during the end of mission screen just because of how rare it actually is to get one. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to be conservative in this regard, especially if you open up the crafting system. The more weapons and items a player has access to, the better chance they'll explore and experiment with a variety of items and work to refine those items to make them their new go-tos. Right now, the only consistent way to get new items is by purchasing them through a rotating hourly shop, which really doesn't feel that good. There's no satisfaction buying a really good item, it's just RNG and hoping you have enough Ordo dockets to purchase the item when you see it pop up. This is a system that's just desperately in need of a revamp, and I think it's doable and will go a long way with the player base. Since we're on the topic of generosity, I think it's fair to address the paltry amount of crafting reagents the team puts into each mission. There's nothing worse than opening up empty chest after empty chest. You talk about a system that subconsciously deteriorates a player's satisfaction for a game, just throw chest after empty chest at them and see what happens. Because of the grindy nature of the game, increasing the crafting materials a noticeable amount would have the opposite effect. It would be a change that's immediately felt by the players, rewarding them for their efforts. There's a balance thing to consider, and I get that. You don't just want to throw thousands of plasteel at players, but I think Fatshark went a bit too conservative with their calculations. Since we're still talking generosity, let's talk secondary objectives. We gotta have more Fatshark, plain and simple. If we're gonna go out of our way to do scriptures and grimoires at level 30, there has to be a reason to actually do them outside of a few Ordo dockets. The obvious answer is to tie these to items and make it clear right at the mission screen what a player could potentially get, because that's going to make them much more inclined to want to go after those secondary objectives. This becomes doubly true when you consider there are plenty of level 30s that get paired with lower level players. Those level 30 players may just be there to try and quickly grind out a match to complete a weekly quest, whereas the lower level player is trying to squeak out some extra XP by doing those side objectives. And if the players don't have shared goals, it's much more likely to cause some tension mid-mission. There's definitely a solution here, one I think is relatively practical and will go a long way to improving the overall experience. This next idea is a bit half-baked, and I'm definitely open to your feedback because I know there's an issue, but I can't put my finger on the pulse of exactly how to fix it. What I realized through my 100 plus hours of playing the game is that the path to the end game is far from optimized, and there are various points of frustration and bottlenecking that really prevent me, and I would assume others, from enjoying the game. The first is the wildly varied MMR system that matches up players based on difficulty. Sometimes this works out great and you get a stellar group. Other times, things don't quite pan out, and although you're a seasoned veteran attempting to form a pickup group for a higher difficulty mission, the game throws a random low-level character that's very clearly a new player. Now, this isn't a major issue in lower difficulty missions, but when you start to dabble in 3s, 4s, and 5s, and you're still facing those same problems, it becomes much more of a headache than anything else. I'm not sure how to address the problem because it would require the developers to create an advanced matchmaking system that takes into account a lot of reference data, something I'm not sure is really in the cards, but something has to help ease the tension between more hardcore and more casual players that inevitably cross-populate during missions. An easier solution would be to rebalance the Ordo dockets and XP gained across all missions, and then put a stricter level gate on those harder difficulty missions. The reality is, low-level players just aren't designed to hang in 4s and 5s, and that's by design. So having them be able to queue up at such an early part in progression seems to be quite the misstep. Another area we could focus on, which goes along a topic we talked about before, has to do with the end of mission rewards. If the team were to implement guaranteed drops, it makes sense to reward those things based on difficulty and the complexity of missions, factoring in every aspect such as secondary objectives and affixes. In a true simplified model, level 1s would reward guaranteed greens, level 2s would reward guaranteed blues, level 3s reward guaranteed purples, level 4s guaranteed golds, and level 5s would reward the not yet implemented red items, which we think are coming. Because item stats are heavily RNG dependent, those guaranteed drops would always be a moment of excitement just because of the prospect of an upgrade is pretty much always on the table. A more realistic approach might also be a more complicated one. You'd have to factor in everything: mission difficulty, secondary objectives, affixes, and all of that would be tied to loot in a similar, albeit different way. For example, every run, no matter the factor, would have a guaranteed drop rate of a base item. Depending on those 3 factors I just mentioned above, you'd have an increased chance of getting a more powerful item. The harder the difficulty, the more challenges you take on, the higher your chance of getting an upgraded item would be. You'd still always get something, but what that item is would vary. Finally, and I touched on this before, we have to do something about the RNG item shop. The timer-limited concept just isn't great. If the team implements guaranteed mission drops, that may take a bit of pressure off the shop, but if the item vendor remains practically the only tangible way to get upgrades, then there has to be a better solution than randomizing everything on an hourly timer. Not only does this create a FOMO effect, which is bad, let's just make that clear, but it's just not a very enjoyable experience. What sort of satisfaction do you get from saying you found the perfect rolled item by sheer dumb luck at a shop? The answer is none. I'm curious what you guys think about this system, because I just don't have a perfect solution for the shop. I think the other changes we've talked about detract from the less than good current system, but if nothing changed and we could only make changes to the shop, I wouldn't have a great answer, but I'm sure one of you will in the comments. Long story short, the progression experience isn't that exciting. It doesn't blend naturally into the endgame for a myriad of reasons. It doesn't mean the gameplay isn't good, because it is stellar, but the experience that accompanies that journey is far from perfect. This last idea is definitely a monster of my own creation and not necessarily addressing a problem within the game, just an opportunity. If you're somewhat around the build scene, you might be aware that build diversity is a bit lacking within the game. Sure, there are some min-max builds going around, that's always going to be the case, but what I'm actually more interested in is more intentional diversity that impacts playstyle. What I'm getting at is actually pretty straightforward. Instead of having a bunch of feats that only change some numbers, come up with feats that actually change the playstyle. Give players drastic options that allow them to explore their character across a more fully realized spectrum. There are limitations to consider, specifically the class-specific abilities, but after hundreds of runs, I'd argue those really don't factor in if you give players more playstyle options. The emphasis here is on diversity, which equates to more fun. It's that simple. This, of course, would require a serious rework. It would most likely have to happen one character at a time, but it's definitely doable. The team has both ranged and melee playstyles they can consider, and if they break out into more utility options, that more directly supports a player's ability to change up their playstyle in new and different ways. What I think we're dealing with now is a lot of sameness across almost all classes. Feats are just slight variations of each other that all do important things, don't get me wrong, but they're just not that interesting. And since there's not a great way to really measure your build in action at this point, it's kind of moot. At the end of the day, my idea of fun just isn't sitting there min-maxing to gain 2 extra DPS during a mission. That ship has sailed for me. It's having that flexibility to take my Psyker and go hard into a Brain Burst build one mission, then be able to pivot and somehow create a frontline warp-wielding melee maniac. By creating more intentionally drastic feat options, the devs could open up a world of possibilities for players that really could elevate the game to some new heights. So there you have it, 5 ideas that I think could drastically change Darktide for the better. As I said in the intro, these are just my opinions, and I don't expect you all to agree with everything, but what I do expect is that you share your thoughts in the comments section below. I got the ball rolling, but I'm sure you guys have some great ideas of how to make the game even better, so feel free to share. While you're down there, don't forget to drop a like on the video and consider subscribing. We're on the hunt for 30,000 subscribers, and as always, your support is greatly appreciated. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.